Now, if there is anything that is important in Path of Exile, I feel that it's doing big damage. Defensives are a close second, but let's be real here. Damage is king. If you want to be able to kill that boss a little bit better, you probably should do more damage. If you want enemies to not be able to kill you, well, you better do more damage and kill them before they kill you. If you've got a problem, bigger DPS can typically solve it. So if you've been having issues scaling damage and you want to know, how do all of these people do hundreds of millions of billions of DPS? Well, I'm going to give you the basics, and I'm also going to go a little bit deeper into some of the ways that you too can scale big DPS. Hey guys, Big Ducks here, and welcome back to the channel. Now remember, if you're enjoying this style of content, make sure that you like this video so that YouTube knows to recommend you more of it. Also, over 75% of you are still not subscribed to this YouTube channel, so if you want to stay up to date with all of my latest content, make sure that you subscribe so that these videos will show right up in your feed, and you can always change your mind later. Now without further ado, let's get back into the video. Alright boys, so remember that there are going to be timestamps down below in the description, so if you want to jump to a particular part of the video, make sure that you check those out. We're going to be going over some of the basics here, so if you already know most of that, go ahead and jump a little bit further into the video. But for all of you that want a refresher course maybe, or maybe this is your first time playing Path of Exile and you just want to know how to do big DPS, I've got some information for you. So the first thing that I want to talk about is spells versus attacks. These are very, very different things in Path of Exile, and they scale significantly different ways. So for a new player, I would say that spells are easily going to be the better option here. So starting off, we will just start with, say, Exsanguinate. This is a new ability that was added in the recent patch. We'll start at level 1. Now, the way that spells scale is that as you level up these spells, as you get more experience and your character levels up, and these spells are socketed into your gear, as they level up, they do more damage. As you can see, we're doing 23.4 base physical damage. When it levels up, it goes up to 30.5. So the more levels that these spells gain, the more damage that they do. This is the reason why I suggest for a new player to be playing a spell build. You don't have to worry about getting gear, you don't have to worry about scaling all kinds of crazy stuff. You level up the spells, you link them to other things, and you're pretty much good, at least for the main portion of the game. So as you can see here, if we scale it all the way up to level 20, we'll start doing significantly more damage. We're up at 1121. Now, one of the main ways that you're going to scale spells, as you can see, plus the levels do give us quite a bit of damage. So if you go above level 20, which is the natural peak that spells are able to get to, you'll notice that the damage increases significantly from 1100 all the way up to 1255. And as you keep going up to, say, like 26, you're all the way up at 2194. Levels above 20 end up being significantly higher amounts of damage. So for spells, you're really wanting to focus on levels of the actual gem itself. Now let's talk about attacks. So attacks are a little bit different. We're going to use Cyclone here because it's a very typical attack that a lot of new players use. So the way that attacks work is they are based off of your actual weapon damage. Now you can be unarmed, meaning that your base damage will be based off of just whatever added damage you have, or you can be using a weapon and your damage will be based off of that. So as you can see here, it says Cyclone deals 56% less attack damage. So because Cyclone hits so often and allows you to move while doing damage, it takes some damage away from your weapon. So with attacks, meaning like melee attacks or bow attacks, you're going to be scaling off of your weapon's actual damage. So if we take something like, say, let's do Terminus S, because this is a very typical weapon that you would use. Terminus S is going to give us quite a bit of base damage here. You'll see it has 173 to 285 damage. That is our base of damage that we're going to be working off of. So that damage is going to be basically hit by the percentage multiplier that you see here on Cyclones. You're only going to be doing let's see, what's math here? 44% of that damage. And the idea is that as you scale this level up, you'll notice that that less damage goes down. So if we bring this all the way to level 20, you'll see that you're doing only 46% less attack damage, and it's got some added damage in there as well. Levels of attacks aren't as important as spells because they don't scale as much off of the actual levels, they scale off of your weapon's damage. This is why I typically tell people that if you're a newer player, spells are going to be easier for you. So now that we know that, let's take a look at actual links and how this works for abilities. So if we go back to Exsanguinate, which is what we had before, and we leave this at level 20, you'll notice that it says deals a certain amount of physical damage and deals a base physical damage over time. So in Path of Exile, there are these things called links. When you have two sockets that are linked together and you use a support gem as well as a damage gem like Exsanguinate, you'll do more damage. You'll get whatever those extra links are. So as you can see, Path of Building here is showing us some extra links that you can use here, so we're going to click Brutality. You'll notice that Brutality says 59% more physical damage. So the reason why links are so important is because when it says more damage, that means multiplicative. It is a multiplier. So you're going to take your damage and multiply it by 59% more, right? So basically you're taking like 159% of the damage, and that's the damage that you're going to do. And as we go further in here, you're going to notice that there are more links that you can do, and you can get all the way up to 6 in normal circumstances. This is why I say a lot of the time that an early 6 link is very important at the beginning of the league, because these links are going to cause you to do more and more and more damage. They're very, very important. So now that we know how gems work and we know how links work, we're going to talk about added versus percentage increased damage. So if we look on the tree, for example, here, we can take a look at this fizz damage here. You'll see that it says percentage increased physical damage. So what this is going to do is going to take your base damage and increase it by a certain percent. If you see the word increase, that means that it's going to be an additive bonus instead of a multiplicative bonus. Multiplicative or a more multiplier is significantly more damage than an increased amount. So if you look here, you're going to see that it says 8% fizz, 8% fizz, 8% fizz. So that is going to increase your base amount of damage. Now what about something that would add to your base amount of damage? So an easy way to look at this would be something called a steel ring. So a steel ring is going to give you this modifier that you'll see up towards the top, adds number to number physical damage to attacks. This is the same way that, say, like a item like this would add it to it. So this is for weapons and this is for attacks, meaning that your base damage would be increased and the multipliers or the percentage increases would increase that base. Now for a spell, this is a little bit different. If we go back to our Exsanguinate option that you'll see here, you can get something that's called added spell damage. So if we take something like Apep's Rage here, right, this wand here, you'll notice that the wand says adds number to number chaos damage to spells. This is going to add it to our base damage of our spells and then is further going to be increased by our percentage increases or more multipliers or so on and so forth. The idea is that if you want to increase the base amount of damage that you're doing, added damage is typically the way. And then after you've got that good base of added damage, you can multiply that through more multipliers, increased multipliers, and there are a ton of them. We'll go over some specific ones later if you're not really following along. So that is the basics of how damage scales. We're going to talk a little bit about gear and some of the items and different things that you can use that may give you an edge on how to increase your damage, especially if you're a new player. So we're going to be looking at our Blade Blast Inquisitor here. This is the Blade Blast Bladefall Inquisitor that you might have seen. I have a video guide about this build. It just has a lot of items that I can use as examples for how to do more damage. So one of the main things that people miss when it comes to doing more damage is really going to be flasks. Unique flasks are very powerful, as well as just random blue rolled flasks can be very powerful. One of the most powerful damage modifiers in the game for a crit build is a diamond flask. We'll talk more about that when I talk about crit. But as you can see, something like Bottled Faith, now keep in mind this is like the most expensive flask in the game, but it's going to increase your base crit, which is huge. It's going to make enemies take increased damage, which is equivalent to a more multiplier. Anytime something says take increased damage, like say if it's like you take increased damage or enemies take increased damage, that is considered a more multiplier. I know that it's kind of confusing, but Path of Exile in general was pretty confusing. Eventually you'll understand all the little weird nuance like that. And then also at the top you'll see 40% increased damage. This is a very, very powerful flask, and turning this flask off actually reduces our damage pretty significantly, from 84 million all the way up to 108 million. Those numbers aren't completely realistic, but just keep along with me here. So the idea is that those flasks will give you a ton of damage. Don't overlook flasks and how important they are. They are one of the major mechanics of this game, especially of your gear. Typically, when you're running around and doing damage, you should be having all of your damage flasks up at all times. They are one of the main focuses of actually doing damage throughout the game, is keeping those flasks up. They're very powerful. The next thing I want to talk about is jewels, and there's a couple different ways that you can scale jewels. One main one is going to be cluster jewels. If you are overwhelmed by cluster jewels, I would suggest that you do take some time and try to learn them, because they are very powerful. Cluster jewels are basically an extension of the skill tree, and they're going to give you unique modifiers that you can't get elsewhere on the skill tree. These modifiers are insanely powerful, and I do suggest that you start familiarizing yourself with cluster jewels. I have another video that you can take a look at. I should link it up in the top if I remember to. If I don't, remind me. But there will be a video that I talked about cluster jewels and how they work and all those kinds of good things, so you can go and check that out. Beyond that, there are also just typical normal jewels. Jewels are some of the most powerful items in this entire game, and that is not an exaggeration whatsoever. When we get into the crit section later on, I'm going to show you how, albeit very expensive jewels, can increase your damage by like multiple times. Like you can do significantly more damage, like 10, 20, 30, 40% more damage with a single jewel sometimes. It's actually kind of insane. So don't overlook jewels. Jewel slots are very, very powerful. If there are jewel sockets around your actual build, you really should look into grabbing them. Things like this intuitive leap here allows you to like skip points on the tree so you can just grab the ones that you want that are very powerful. There's all kinds of insanely powerful jewels, like these timeless jewels, which give you new keystones. Jewels are not to be overlooked. They are very, very powerful. A great way to scale your damage. The next thing we're going to talk about are weapons. Now, weapons are very different depending on if you're attack build or if you're a spell build. This build in particular uses a very unique interaction on the tree, and I'll show you that here. So we have this thing called Instruments of Virtue, which is giving us Battle Mage, and it says gain added spell damage equal to the damage of your main hand weapon. So alternative to how most builds scale, you'll see that this Volconus weapon we have here has some base damage, you'll see Fizz base damage and Elemental base damage. So we've got 140 to 282 physical damage and 155 to 225 elemental damage. Now normally, this would only really be useful for an attack build. Those damages would be your base damage. It would just be the amount of damage that you're scaling later on with your percentage multipliers. However, in this specific circumstance, and this is the reason why Inquisitor is so strong, we are taking those numbers and adding them to the base damage of our spells, meaning that we're further increasing the base that we're increasing later on with all of those multipliers. Now, a normal spell build will be using things like this, where we're just looking for the stats on the item, meaning like spell damage or global crit strike multiplier or like added damage to spells, things like that. Cast speed would be good here. Gain physical as extra fire damage is very good for like physical spells. Those kinds of things are what you'd really be looking for on an actual weapon. Now, I do want you to keep in mind that there is a difference between something called a local modifier and a global modifier. These are very, very important, and I want to make sure because a lot of people get this wrong. If you're looking at specifically a weapon and you see something that says added fire damage, or say like something like added fizz damage or percentage increased fizz damage, or say it says increased critical strike chance. These are local modifiers, meaning that they affect the weapon itself. So if you see here where it says adds 2 to 3 fire damage on this weapon, and you notice in the elemental damage at the top it says 2 to 3. For this to affect spells, you would have to have something that says added damage to spells specifically. Now this is only relevant or physical damage as well as added damage. If you got something that says like at the bottom where it says increased fire damage, that actually is global. I know that that's a little bit confusing, but I'll recap for you real quick. Added damage, when it just says added damage, is always local. If it says added damage to spells, that means it's added damage to all spells. If something says increased physical damage on a weapon, that is local. If it says increased any other kind of damage, it is not local. So keep those things in mind and make sure that you understand the difference between them. So if you're playing something like my Poison Blade Vortex Assassin and you see a weapon that has like 180% increased fizz damage, that is not going to increase the damage of your Blade Vortex. It's only going to increase the damage of the weapon itself. I know a lot of people get that wrong, so I wanted to make like doubly, triply sure that you understood what I'm talking about. Oh, and it is also relevant for crit strike. If it says increased critical strike chance and you see the crit strike chance of the weapon itself changed, it is a local modifier. But that's pretty much all that we need to talk about when it comes to local versus global modifiers. Beyond that, the next thing that I want to talk about is jewelry. Jewelry is actually very important for a lot of builds to scale their damage properly. If we're looking at things like rings, you can get anything from like percentage increased damage, which will be global because it's not a weapon, or you can get added damage. If you do see something on a ring that says like adds number to number fire damage, this is to everything. Keep that in mind. If it doesn't say attacks or it doesn't say spells and it is not on a weapon, it adds it to everything. I know it's confusing, but unfortunately that's the way that they've made it. You'll also see things like normal rings, which have like added physical damage to attacks and such and such. These are very, very powerful because they're going to add to your base attack damage, meaning that you're going to be able to scale that later on. And then amulets can also have things like global crit strike multiplier. They can have things like plus the level of spells, gain physical damage as extra certain damage here. All kinds of crazy damage modifiers can be found on your jewelry. These are very, very competitive slots for damage. Make sure that you're giving them proper attention. An amulet is one of the biggest DPS increases of an entire build sometimes. And then the last thing is going to be your actual armor pieces. For the most part, the biggest damage that you can get out of your actual gear is going to be the gloves most of the time, and then of course having a 6-link in your chest piece or your weapon. But gloves out of the rest of the gear that's left, between like gloves and boots and helmet and all that kind of stuff, it's typically the gloves that have the big damage modifiers. This is where you can get like percentage damage over time multiplier, or like ignites deal damage faster, culling strike, all kinds of those modifiers are typically on the glove, so those are very important to look out for. And that is going to be most of what you really need to pay attention to when it comes to your items. This is a game about items. It's about getting better items, equipping better items, leveling up, and making your character more powerful. You really can't overlook each and every little spot. They're all important. So now that we've talked about the basics, we've talked about gear, I do want to talk about some outliers in the way that you scale damage, and those are going to be damage over time as well as critical strike and critical strike multiplier. These work a little bit differently than most other things, so I want to make sure to go into these specifically. So with this build, the first thing we're going to talk about is crit strike multiplier. What is a critical strike? If you are familiar with RPGs in general, you probably already know, but a critical strike is when you actually hit and roll a critical strike, it does increase or more damage. In Path of Exile, when you crit, it has a base damage of 150%. That is your base critical strike multiplier. Now, as you can see on the left here, you're going to notice that it says 489% here. That is my crit strike multiplier. Normally it's 150, but that's significantly higher. If you take your crit chance and you gain multiplier from it, I'll show you an example here. This is 12, 24, and then, I don't do math, 54. So 54% crit strike multiplier. And you see if we remove these three nodes, keep an eye on the DPS on the left, it's at 108 million right now. And we take these three nodes out, it drops down to 96 million. So we lost 10 million DPS, or roughly 12.4% of our damage just from this 54 crit strike multiplier. That is a lot of damage. And the more crit strike multiplier that you scale, the more damage you're going to do. So if we have a 100% crit chance, essentially we're just always doing 489% of our normal damage at all times. That is a more multiplier. Crit strike multiplier is a more multiplier. It is an insane amount of damage, and this is how people scale those builds. If you look on like PoE Ninja and stuff like that, where they get up to like hundreds and hundreds of millions of damage, this is typically how they do it, is with more multipliers, meaning like crit multipliers. Another thing to keep in mind is that jewels are actually insanely powerful here. You might have noticed that some people have these jewels that are like, keep in mind, these are like 20, 30, 40 exalt a jewel, but it is possible to get upwards of 50% multiplier on a single jewel plus life, or energy shield if that's what you want. So if you get like critical strike multiplier globally, critical strike multiplier with spells, and then like critical strike multiplier with like fire skills, and you're using a fire skill, and all of those are like 14%, you can get some insane damage scaling. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of damage. Considering that you can have like 10 of those jewels, I mean, you can get some pretty insane numbers. It's got like 6 very, very close jewel sockets that it could get, and you would take that 6 and times it by like 45% multiplier. That's an insane amount of multiplier if you really, really wanted to push the damage of a build. So the average player isn't really going to be able to get those. However, a life or energy shield plus like 1 crit strike multi-jewel with maybe some damage should be significantly cheaper than like the 3 crit multis. Those are like multiple exalt region of price. So with crit, you need to scale as much crit chance as you can, and you need to scale as much crit multiplier as you can. A good place to be in crit chance is like 70 to 80%. There's one last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to crit, and that is going to be the diamond flask. Now, ignore all of the unique properties here. We're just looking at the line that says your critical strike chance is lucky. For someone that doesn't have capped critical strike chance, this build does. This is a very, very powerful modifier. The term lucky, what that means is that when you roll, or when the game determines whether or not you're going to crit, what lucky does is that it rolls that crit once. If you don't crit, it will roll again, and if you do crit that time, it all counts as a crit. The idea is that if you see lucky or unlucky, it works that way. It's basically like you get to roll twice and it takes the best of each of the rolls. So this is a very easy way to significantly increase your crit strike chance. So if you're having issues with, getting that crit rating up there, you can use one of these in the meantime. But most of the time, only really an Inquisitor or say like an Assassin can really scale that much crit. But that's most to do with actual crit. The next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be damage over time multiplier. So let's swap over to my Poison Blade Vortex so we can talk about that. So one of the main reasons that I feel damage over time builds are as powerful as they are is because they have this thing called damage over time multiplier. It is just a multiplier for your damage that is seemingly very easy to get. Most other builds require crit to be able to get the same kind of damage, and crit is very expensive. So the idea is that with a damage over time skill, we're getting more multipliers essentially for free. But something that you'll notice is that there's just a bunch of just like damage over time multiplier. There's 10 damage over time multiplier here, 10 to chaos damage over time multiplier here. Like if we look at cold damage over time multiplier, there is like cold damage over time multiplier here and here, as well as breath of rhyme up in this, like 10 damage over time multiplier here, and then 4, 4, there's lots of just damage over time multipliers all throughout the tree. So typically, sources of damage over time, meaning like poison, ignite, cold damage over time, bleed. Now we do have the new physical damage over time spells. All of this is very, very easy to scale your damage up because these sources are just pretty available all over the place. There's cluster jewels that have it. There's nodes on the tree. There's a lot of just gear out there that has damage over time multipliers, like gloves have pretty much all the different damage over time multipliers available to them. There's tons of it on weapons, on wands, on scepters, all kinds of things like that. So damage over time tends to have a little bit easier time scaling, especially without high levels of gear, because you can get these damage over time multipliers so easily. Poison on top of that also can scale with like poison duration as well as stacks, meaning that damage over time is just a very simple way to scale insane amounts of damage. But that is a little bit different than the way that normal damage scales. So now that I've gone over crit and now that I've gone over how damage over time multiplier works, I do want to talk a little bit about the different things that you can do, like these little like tips and tricks and things that you can do to increase your damage. I know these are pretty popular because a lot of people overlook some of these, but there are a bunch of modifiers in here that'll give you some hints how to do more damage. Things like power charges and frenzy charges are very, very powerful. Frenzy charges are pretty easy to get, at least while clearing for most builds, as long as you have some level of recovery. You can use Blood Rage. It's a skill that will just grant you frenzy charges on kill. As you can see, frenzy charges are very, very powerful. If we look at our damage with Blade Vortex here is 8.7 million, just turning on frenzy charges gives us 1 million DPS. Beyond that, there are things like Unholy Might, which is a big portion of damage. We're getting that from our Cluster Jewel. Making sure that we use Consecrated Ground well, like using things like Zealotry. If we're a crit build, you can put Consecrated Ground on enemies. Making sure that you are doing things like keeping Withered stacks up on enemies. I want to show you something. So we're at 8.7 million. With 0 Wither stacks, we're doing 5.6 million. So if you're keeping your Wither stacks up, you're going to be doing a ton more damage. Another thing is like keeping Wave of Conviction up on enemies if you're doing fire or lightning damage, or like Frost Bomb if you're doing cold damage. Those are exposures, which do not stack, by the way, but exposure is like reducing the elemental resistance of an enemy, which is going to cause them to take more damage. Elemental resistance penetration is a very powerful damage mechanic because it essentially makes an enemy have less resistances, which means you do more damage to them. So in a situation where you're removing like say 20% elemental resistance from a target through like a curse or an exposure or something like that, it's essentially more damage. Beyond that, there are other little things that you can take note of, like making sure if something like getting like an intimidation or an unnerved stack. Unnerved is something that you can get from like gloves, or you can get it from Blade Blast. Intimidate is something that it's on like, I think Awakened Melee Fizz has Intimidate, and there's also a couple other ways to get that through like Ascendancies and things like that. But all of this together, if you keep all these little multipliers and you add them up, add them up, add them up, add them up, you're going to be doing significantly more damage. So make sure that you look through here, try enabling things and seeing if there's something that will make you do more damage, and then find a way to implement that somehow on your character. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, there is a lot of different little things that can happen when it comes to damage and doing damage, so I may have missed some things. If you have any further questions, make sure that you check out my Twitch page at twitch.tv/BigDucks. I'm streaming Monday through Friday, 11 to 4, maybe even longer than that. But either way, that's Eastern time in the United States, so make sure that you come and ask me over there if you have any questions. If I'm not live, or maybe I wasn't able to answer your question, try checking out my Discord. Those are linked down in the description. I have a ton of helpful community members over on Discord, and I'd be happy to have you be part of the community. So remember guys, if you enjoy this content, make sure that you like this video so that you can see more of it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content similar to this, and stay safe out there in Raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.